Hey guys, how's it going? My name's Arden, and today we're going to review a whole bunch of comics. So yesterday I reviewed three Marvel books, I think. What did I review? Black Widow, Empire, Fantastic Four number zero, and something else. But my comic book store didn't have the DC books ready, and I hadn't quite finished the indie books that I'd pulled. So we're basically doing part two of this stream now. And just like yesterday and how we've been kind of doing these streams, I'll order them from the ones I like least to the ones I like most. Jalil Riley, Davian Davlin, and Tevye Smoka, thanks for, I don't know if you guys are still here, but you dropped nice messages in chat before we started streaming. So welcome for those of you who have joined us. And with that, we'll get started. So, I like to think of these as from least enjoyed to most enjoyed, not necessarily worst to best, because we aren't necessarily describing a bad comic right out of the gate. It's all just relative to what I pulled each week. Hello, Daniel Ross. Thanks for joining us. So, out of 5 books we're going to talk about today, the one at the bottom I'm going to put as Catwoman 80th Anniversary. Now, I quite like this book. So that's why I kind of wanted to preface it at the beginning. I pretty much liked everything that we're going to talk about today, but Catwoman definitely had the biggest range in terms of quality because, like all the other 80th anniversary books, it's a series of short stories kind of celebrating the character, featuring major figures that have worked on this character over the years, and just, a usual collection of artwork and that sort of thing, whatever else they can fit in 100 pages. So, some of these stories are phenomenal, some of them not so much. I'm going to just kind of go through them one by one real quick. But first up is Skin to Cat featuring Paul Dini. And I'm not going to go through every single artist for each of these. That'd be 4 names per thing. I'll bring them up when appropriate. Dini's book, or little story, was really great. The artist did a really good job at kind of just evoking a nice classic comic book style. And it felt like a story straight out of Batman the Animated Series, which Dini's really popular for working on. It's a very simple story. It plays up on the cat theme of this character, which is kind of fun because a few stories do that. This is, I think, the best one in terms of how it uses Catwoman's nature to inform the story, because we don't see that a lot these days. Catwoman's much more of a different character now, and the whole cat theme and cat puns has been stepped away from. I don't think it's a bad thing overall, but it's fun to see that back in action. It's fun to see basically the animated series version of Catwoman in this story, and I like what she does. She basically goes up against a taxidermist that was killing big cats, and has him ultimately attacked by big cats himself, and is horribly murdered. So, Denny don't play around. I think he really had a good, solid understanding of how to tell a Batman story, or still has, I guess, a really solid understanding of how to tell a Batman story. Because, he kind of understands Catwoman to a degree here really well. He's not afraid to have her basically kill someone because he's been poaching large cats, and I don't disagree with it. I just think it's funny. I also really like the artwork featuring just different depictions of Catwoman over the years. So we have her first appearance in Batman #1, March 1940, and then Batman #3, where she's got the cat mask, and they actually do bring that up in another story. Good stuff. Next up, I think, is the worst story of them all. It's called Now You See Me by Ann Nocenti, and features Robson Rocca on pencils. And like I said, I'm not going to go through all the artists every single time. Nocenti wrote Catwoman during the New 52 era, kind of infamously. This little story reminded me of what people objected to, or the problem with her writing in the New 52 when it came to Catwoman, because this story, I should say, is all over the place. Action isn't really conveyed as effectively as I would like. So there's a moment where she shatters or throws away some bird thing that has some code that this corrupt cop wants her to use with him together. Davian, I'll get to that when we get to that book. But I am excited about it, don't worry. So Nocenti's kind of all over the place, and it's a bit whatever. I should say that I picked up this 80th anniversary book, not because it's brand new, but because I really liked the Green Lantern 80th anniversary. I wasn't really sure how Catwoman would play out. I don't think it was quite as effective. For one thing, they couldn't have this cool blend of all the different Green Lanterns over the years. This is all just Selena Kyle's story, which isn't necessarily wrong in and of itself, but there was a much bigger difference in terms of the quality of stories. And Nocenti's book really felt weak to me and just straight out of her time with New 52. Tevye says, why the New 52? I'm guessing you're asking why they wanted her to do it. I get it. Nocenti's a big name, like, and has this track record in comics that holds up from before the New 52. I was hoping maybe, like, part of it was New 52's editorial climate and stuff that held her back from really being the full writer she could be, but that's not true anymore, and her story's by far the weakest. Next up might be the strongest story, and that's a hell of a compliment to me, from me, because it's the story Helena by Tom King and Mikkel Janin doing the art. Now, I'm sure we all are aware by now that I have very mixed feelings about Tom King's time with Batman. This story doesn't really get into a lot of that, but it kind of does. Because it's all about basically the birth of Helena Wayne. And obviously this isn't an in-continuity story, but goddamn, I mean, Tom King, this is like catnip for Tom King. Because it's like, oh, story about a superhero having a kid? Like, of course he wants to write that story. Of course that's his contribution to the Catwoman book. But, you know, it was really done well. And I've talked about how much I like this particular version of Huntress, and she's not really, like, you see her, but just like this, dressed in plain clothes. You don't really see her as the Huntress. That's not what this story is about. This story is about Selena, and that page I just showed you guys is moving as hell. Tom King did a really good job with his part of the story, and like I said, might be my favorite. Also, love this page on, like, at the end of his story, the Catwoman in the 1960s. All of the, like, they change it up each time, so all of these little shots of Catwoman over the years are great. I don't know if I showed you guys the 50s one, but it's right here. I like this outfit on her. It's always kind of looked pretty cool to me and just held up in fun ways. Out of the older appearances of Catwoman, that might be one of my favorites. This one just feels straight up Black Widow, but I don't know. I don't think it was a Black Widow ripoff. Looking at the timing of it all, those characters came out, I think this character came out before Black Widow even. Anyways, next up is also an excellent story, Catwoman of Earth by Jeff Parker and Jonathan Case. It uses that costume actually, and it feels straight out of, like, the Batman 66 era. It's about these aliens coming to Earth and Catwoman basically saving the day. Davian was saying King and Bendis need to go from Marvel. Oh, need to go to Marvel. I don't know if I want Bendis back at Marvel. I think Tom King would benefit from going to Marvel at some point. As much as, like, I don't hate him as a writer, I really like Strange Adventures, and I'm looking forward to getting the next issue of that next week. Tom King did a cool job with Vision, and I think he could contribute in an interesting way, and maybe there's some lessons that can be learned from his time with Batman. I don't know what kind of character I'd want Tom King to write. I'd have to think about that. Maybe that'll occur to me a little later. Next up, okay, so yeah, the alien story's great. It ends pretty abruptly or whatever, like a lot of these stories do. One thing I like about these stories is they're not, like, overly sappy and celebrating Catwoman. They just feel like little short vignettes of Catwoman. This is her during the 70s. I don't know if I showed that page yet. But then we move on to another excellent story by Liam Sharp, who does story art and coloring. I know him from Green Lantern and his time with Grant Morrison. But he does a good job with this. This is, I think, the sole example of a writer-artist, like someone doing writing and art. Yep. It's kind of weak because of that, at least from a story perspective. I actually don't care. The story is really nothing. It's just a means to execute a cool little bit of art where Catwoman's just confronting the security guard and just going through all these different scenarios of what could happen between them. Like, she could kill him, they could team up, and she just goes through all these things. So from a story perspective, it's pretty weak, and it's only 3 pages long. But from an art perspective, he does an amazing job. Like, just take a good look at that page of her, like where she just goes full aggro. She doesn't actually do that. This is one of the stories she's telling the guy, and then he just faints in response to it. Liam Sharp did a really good job with that, and I quite like it. After that is my favorite page in this whole thing, Catwoman in the 80s. Look how cool that picture is. I was like, oh, well, I don't regret buying this one single bit the second I saw this page. I was like, well, this made buying the whole thing worth it, because I thought that was just so cool. Catwoman #1 from February 1989. And just having like a print copy of that's neat. Amar Avenger says, I think DC in comics is much more successful than Marvel. In terms of, in terms of volume sold, they compete with each other, so they compete with each other. If you're talking about how they execute characters or whatever, that's a matter of debate, and then Amara's saying I prefer Marvel anyways. It's an interesting opinion. I don't think I share it. I would say like DC kind of consistently sells the top books if you look at the most selling book that sells each month, but Marvel tends to dominate in terms of their wider volume as you go down the line. So if you are looking at the top 10 that sells each month, the top 5 might be dominated by DC, but then the next 15 might feature Marvel pretty heavily. So they do sell about the same units. At least I don't watch the sales as much anymore, and I'm sure they're all over the place right now because of the virus, but in my experience, that's pretty balanced. Davian saying, I got the 90s variant. I love her 90s series. I went with this one. In spite of what I was saying about the Black Widow thing, I do love Batman 66, and it was an easy choice for me out of the variants that they still had at the store. This was a little older, the book. It was released a month or two ago, but yeah. Amar saying, I'm watching you from Algeria, bro. That's cool, man, because a lot of our viewers are from the US, and I don't have anything against America, but it's always neat when it's beyond that, because we get a little demographic ticker of where everyone's from. Most of our viewers are from Canada. Most of our viewers are from America or the UK. A very small percentage are actually from Canada, even though Joey and I are both Canadian. So it's neat when people reach out from Brazil or Algeria and stuff like that. Hope things are going well over there. I haven't heard much from Algeria recently, but in this day and age, no news is usually good news. So let's put it that way. Davian saying, how are they even calculating the sales for June? I don't know. I think it's going to be really messy. They don't have, it's not all going to be from Diamond now either. That's a bit of a loss in terms of DC stepping away from Diamond Comics, but I don't think it's the worst thing in the world. Anyhow, after this is a story called Little Bird by Mandy Newell and Lee Garbett doing the art, Alex Sinclair doing the colors. I really like Alex Sinclair's coloring, and this book is a cool example of that. I didn't even know that was him. This book is straight out of Frank Miller's time, so it doesn't hold back. She's an escort in this story, and it gets into Catwoman's roots and her growing up. I found it really touching. There's this plot beat that I can actually shed a little bit of light on for those that don't know, called, someone who's Jewish should have a better, mezuzah. So it's this little thing that Jewish people put on the door of their house, and it's just a little traditional thing. We actually had one growing up outside of our home. So it's all just kind of about Catwoman dealing with this very valuable mezuzah that used to belong to a woman who raised her, and meanwhile she's dealing with basically in this continuity having only recently met Batman and starting to consider a life of crime and a life of thievery and petty not petty theft grand larceny instead of working as an escort. It's a well-handled story, and Mindy Newell does a good job, and it kind of reminds me, I'm sure there's a lot of opinions about this aspect of Catwoman. I'm sure there's a lot more opinions about how Frank Miller handled that back when he did Batman Year One, when this stuff was introduced. I think Mindy Newell does a good job of dealing with this in a respectful way, where it's not at the detriment of Catwoman's character, but it's I don't know, I'm not comfortable with the idea of Catwoman can't be this because of reasons X, Y, and Z, and kids and blah, blah, blah. Certainly this stuff should be downplayed in stories directed to children, but beyond that, I think it's more realistic that characters have gone through this and have had this life, and it shouldn't be demonized or looked down on so heavily. But we don't have to get into the politics of all of that. I just thought it was interesting that they embraced that and put that in her 80th anniversary book. I was impressed. I really like most of these stories I really liked. So far, we've only really hit on Anne Nescentis being kind of weak. Everything else I can really appreciate the value. Catwoman in the 90s, including featuring her animated series appearance, which is great. Friggin' great. Then we go to a great. So you can see they're going through her decades with her. We've had people kind of representing each era of Catwoman's history as we go along. And for the 90s, of course, it made all the sense in the world to have Born to Kill, written by Chuck Dixon, and then Kelly Jones and Danny Mickey and Steve Olive doing the art. I'll bring them all up because they, this is straight up Batman 90s art, and I'm all here for it. They do a good job. Catwoman goes up against Clayface a bunch. Well, not a bunch, just in the story. It's well handled. It's very 90s in terms of like how characters are drawn and even how Catwoman interacts with Clayface. But the best aspect of that, and Chuck Dixon's the right person to bring out the best aspect of the 90s. It was great to read a book by him again, and left me thinking a lot about what's going on with there. Davian saying, also speaking of Batman Beyond, do you read the current Batman Beyond comics? Also live action movie. It'd be cool to do the live action movie. I have read some of the comics. I'm way behind now. Like I was reading them back in the era of New 52. I haven't checked it out in a while. They're fine. Those kind of books I haven't really gotten into much lately. Like they also have the Batman The Adventures Continue, which is following up on the 90s stories. I love those cartoons, but I'm not that nostalgia driven, I guess. Catwoman in the 2000s, and we have the most insane story called Conventional Wisdom by Will Pfeiffer. And I don't know if I want to give away what it's all about exactly, but basically Catwoman finds herself at a Batman convention. So like all Batman and the other villains are all just signing autographs, and she's like, what's going on? There's people dressed as her from different cosplay eras, including references she doesn't understand. So at one point she encounters her Tim Burton movie self, and she's like, how do you even get into that costume? And she sees her 66 version, and the 66 version has like the henchmen and stuff dressed as crazy cats. It's all really well done. And there's a good explanation behind it, and the reveal of it all is pretty great and leads to this huge tone change in terms of the art in the last page. And for a fun little story like this, it's great. Batman in the 2010s is the next page, including this shot. It left me thinking about the wedding, but like this story had a good little follow-up by Ram 5 or Ram V, I don't know how you say his name. Fernando Blanco doing the art, called Addicted to Trouble, kind of dealing with Catwoman and her sister being on the run after the fallout of the first wedding, and them kind of like Catwoman coming to terms with it, and her basically losing the wedding dress in a moment I actually kind of liked. I didn't hate this book, or like this part of the story. I keep calling them books, but they're not books. It's part of a book. It squared off some of that Tom King Batman stuff in a way I didn't actually hate, which is not terrible. And so the story was pretty good, and I liked the stuff going on between Catwoman and her sister. And then last up is, again, a pretty great story. It's written by Ed Brubaker, although I just noticed it had art, coloring, and letters by Cameron Stewart. So, last Cameron Stewart book we're ever going to see from DC. Good riddance, but he did do a good job of this. Whatever you want to say about that guy, he did a good job with art, coloring, and lettering in this thing. That doesn't excuse his behavior. And the story's pretty whatever, but it's basically taking us right into the present and taking a little chunk out of the current Catwoman series, is my understanding of it. Well, kind of. That's more of, I guess, the previous story, but Ed Brubaker kind of brings it home, I feel, to the present day, and Brubaker's writing is really the selling point of this book because, or like the story, I did it again, and he just does a good job with it, and it's interesting enough. So, I think I would recommend it overall. In spite of some issues here or there, it's a pretty fun 80th anniversary. It's what I liked about the 80th Green Lantern anniversary, where it's not like overly sappy, and it's just a pretty good down-to-earth series of stories with like big names attached to it. In that regard, it's pretty good. One weak story from Ann Nesenti doesn't make a bad thing overall. So I'd probably recommend it. Most comic book stores, I would imagine, still have copies lying around if you want to get it. And I'm probably going to pick up Joker 50th next week and see if I can get Robin 50th or 80th. 50th. We're way past 50th now. Of ours saying it would be awesome if they do an episode of DCeased for a series of what ifs. Oh, sure, there's so many things they can do about DCeased, but we're not going to talk about DCeased yet. Oh, we will, but don't worry. I'm ranking these by how much I like them. So we're not ready for DC yet. Next up is a great comic, and to be honest, like we just start kind of getting into weird moments of preference with all 5 of these books because they're all pretty great. Justice League number 48. So I reviewed 2 weeks ago, I believe, the most recent arc of Justice League featuring the Spectre and doing a lot of pretty cool stuff. We got a new writer, well, not a new writer, but we got a different writer for this story, Cy Spurrier, and Aaron Lopresti doing pencils, Matt Ryan doing inks, David Barron doing colors, Tom Napolitano doing lettering, David Marquez doing this pretty great cover. And it's called Overlords, the story. And it's an appropriate name. Basically, the Justice League saves this arc, like by arc I mean spaceship arc, of children being sent to like this planet, and these kids describe how their planet is consumed by 2 warring races, basically. One who went in the direction of technology, one that went in the direction of biology. And they're ruled over by this crazy empress who like unites the two and rules over them with like mind control and all this forcible stuff. So the Justice League brings these kids home, a little weary, obviously, of everything. Davian saying, was Justice League the lead into Dark Knight's death metal event? I was reading this. I believe these stories all take place in between. Well, I don't know, because it's published. I think these take place after, although it's hard to tell. The thing is, they're published after Year of the Villain, but kind of around death metal. So my interpretation is it's kind of either it fits in between Doomsday Clock and Year of the Villain, or it takes place all after that without really acknowledging any spoilers coming out of death metal. So it exists at a very weird place of continuity. Actually, you know what, now that I think about it, the best interpretation of it is it exists during the Year of the Villain, in between all the crazy stuff going on with, Batman Who Laughs and Lex Luthor's ploys. I actually think it could fit into that moment pretty easily, including the story with the Spectre and stuff. Like, these stories kind of feel like side things, and I was talking about it before, like these Justice League stories very much feel like a bit of a break from the insane, multiversal, epic nature of death metal. This stuff feels, even though we're dealing with space aliens and like mystical realms and usual Justice League stuff, it's still more grounded and still more focused and zeroed in on just, this stuff. Tevia's saying continuity is a mess right now. I guess it's always been like this, though. You gotta kind of just roll with the punches and stuff. And because it's a nice break from the epic stuff going on and it doesn't have to involve any of that, I don't actually dislike it. Tevia's saying, speaking of 5G, apparently there's a rumor that 5G will be a separate line altogether. Oh boy. They're making so many lines if that's true. That sounds like a bleeding cool rumor. Not to dismiss what you're saying, Tevia, but I'm just saying. Quan Bena asks a very loaded question. Who is my favorite writer? I mean, I could go with like current, I could go with DC and stuff. Okay, you're shorting out my brain. I don't know. Like Grant Morrison does some really interesting things, but I wouldn't call him my favorite writer. We'll talk about Charles Soule a little later. I really like him, but I wouldn't call him my favorite writer. That's like a whole separate video, amigo. No, I don't know if I can narrow it down. It's kind of like asking who your favorite superhero is. I could give you an answer, but it'll change every day. So why don't we say, for now, Tom Taylor. It'll probably change next time someone asks me that, but I'll go with that for now. He's very reliable, I'll give you that. And he's written some kick-ass comics. But it's also not super deep. So I wouldn't, Yeah, can't call him my favorite writer. I'm just joking. I was just pulling a name in front of me. Cy Spurrier is great. Yeah, as Tevye said, it's from that story's from Bleeding Cool, who I don't trust. Yeah, they'll publish anything. I don't hate Bleeding Cool as much as other people. I think there's a place for them in the comic book industry, but you have to take it with a grain of salt. And other people have made a good argument for the harm Bleeding Cool causes, and I don't disagree with that. I think there's room for a website like Bleeding Cool, but it should be run by a person better than Rich Johnson, who's deeply underwhelming in so many ways. And he might tweet at me about this because he's weird like that, but I can block him if I have to. Tevye was saying, any opinion on Grant Morrison Green Lantern, because I feel like the series is confusing. I'm behind on it, but I have almost all of those books to catch up on purchased digitally, so I just have to work my way through it. I don't usually find Grant Morrison that confusing, but I understand how people can, and I understand the frustration with that. I don't think it's unfair, to be frustrated by that a bit. I think it's interesting how Green Lantern's out there and going in a different direction, and it's neat how he's taking a step away from the usual stuff that's been going on since Jeff Johns reinvented Green Lantern and kind of doing his own thing. I still haven't gotten into Black Star stuff yet, so I'm that far behind, so I really can't speak to season 2 yet. It could get more confusing. Grant Morrison's certainly capable of that. Anyways, where were we? So they help. So they come to the race, and basically in my favorite moment, they come and realize that the Justice League sends a message, and basically these people overthrow their Empress, and as they're approaching this planet, they find that the two races are about to kill the Empress and just execute her for her crimes. Wonder Woman's I don't think we should step in, and we don't know the situation here. Maybe we shouldn't intervene. I hate it too, but maybe we shouldn't save this life. We don't know what this woman did. Superman is I can't do that. He flies in, he crushes their weapons, and he's take her away, free the people, kind of thing. And he says, I'll say the line because it's great. I can almost hear you glaring at me, Wonder Woman. I couldn't let them kill her. I never claimed to be non-interventionist. And then there's this great moment where all these people are reunited with their kids on the Ark. So then the people are well, they start showing the Justice League around. They're thank you for saving us and stuff. But then they're oh, we need a new ruler, but we're so divided, it has to be you. And they basically ask them, will you lead us and take over our people? And then Wonder Woman really freaks out. And in a moment I feel is a little overly dramatic, because I would imagine everyone in the Justice League would be on the same page as her. She's well, we can set them up and help them out, but we can't rule them. We can't stay here and become the leaders of this planet, which is I don't know, it just seemed like a given, and she just want to work with them to do what she's saying, and everyone would be on that same page. But before they can really get into that any further, they get attacked by this crazy alien thing, and basically this alien's well, now you're not fighting with each other. I represent these mercenaries, and we're just going to come in and invade you. Superman's everyone get down, we're going to stop this crazy mercenary creature, and they all just bow down. And Superman's oh no, not like that. And then the alien blows up, and that's the end of the issue. Big old explosion. I assume everyone will be fine, but basically the Justice League has to deal with oh, there's this helpless planet, and they want the Justice League to rule over them. And I think there's a lot of interesting potential here. Cy Spurrier feels like a more classic-y comic book writer that harkens back to an older day, but this is an interesting issue, and not physically just an issue. The actual issue being debated here is kind of neat. Yeah, like I said, it was a little overwrought, and aspects of it could have been handled better, or at least this wasn't an exceptional comic, but I was interested, and I was oh, that's pretty cool. I kind of want to see where this is going. And I really like the artwork on it. It's pretty standard in terms of the comic booky stuff, but it just feels so alien and different from what we've been getting out of DC, and some shots are great. When they reveal the Justice League, they want the Justice League to rule, that's a good shot, with them overlooking this massive crowd in front of the throne. That says that moment in the visuals as much as the dialogue does, or like speaks to that moment. You know what I'm saying? Amar saying who's my favorite character in DC. Yeah, it's the same issue as who's my favorite writer. Like, I don't have an easy favorite. It depends on who's writing it, right? Uh, no, I don't. I don't know. Terry McGinnis, I guess. Devian was saying, I can't wait to finally get my hands on Batman Earth 1 Volume 3. Um, yeah, man, that sounds cool. So, it's a pretty good comic. I'd say it's fairly standard. I put it a little bit above Catwoman just because, as much as I liked Catwoman, that debate going on here and that idea of like Justice League just having to take over for these people that, like this alien race that needs leadership right now is kind of interesting. There's a lot of ways that story can be handled well or poorly, but for now it's piqued my interest and I'll probably check out the next issue, which is really all the comic can do. So, next up is Bitter Root, a series we haven't really talked about before, so I'm going to kind of briefly review the whole thing. Bitter Root is a series I first discovered at the end of last year. It was a frequently mentioned suggestion when we were going over the top 10 of 2019. Because of the way I did voting for that, it ended up not winning because I kind of skirted out the comics, although because we do those things publicly, I don't think this ever really would have won like that. It's a different kind of book. I don't even know if I put it in my top 10 of like the comics because I made a separate video about that, which is an interesting choice on my part, but because now that like I'm more because I read the first few issues when I made that decision. Now that I'm caught up to issue 6, the most recent issue that came out, like just last week or like this week I think, I just found this on the shelf. I was like, oh great, I'm up to issue 5. I need this, but I think it came out with everything else too. It's great though. Right on the cover of this book, actually, it says Best New Series of 2019 according to Entertainment Weekly, but like it's a strong new series. So the creators of this are David F. Walker, Chuck Brown, and Sanford Green. Sophie Dodson did the coloring, Clayton Cowles did lettering, and Sanford Green did the cover. These guys are awesome. This is an Image book. It's an entirely original story just about like this family called the Sangires who fight crazy demons, and it's a bit of a period piece. It's well made. It's really interesting. So like, cause like a story like this, they got like the whole thing is like they have the bitter roots, referring to like they use these plants to create these weapons that can fight these demons. And I feel like when I was reading this most recent issue in particular, I was thinking a lot about how a lesser creative team would have struggled with this story not just being another echo of Ghostbusters or something along those lines. And it would fall into those tropes a lot. It would just resemble a lot of those stories. Bitterroot doesn't do that, where it's telling us take the first 5 issues, and 6 is just kind of building right up on that, so it's not any different, but the first 5 issues form the first trade and are a solid introduction for the series. But instead of doing all the stuff that books like this will usually do, where we introduce the characters, they all have to come together, that sort of thing, they tell this story in an interesting enough way that we don't go through those typical cliches over and over again. And it's constantly undermining that. These are the villains of the story, like comforting a family whose son was lynched. These characters are well written and deep and interesting. There's a lot of mythology and lore and world building in this story, which got me really hooked into things because it gives everything kind of this weight, and also there's this mystery. Like I want to learn more about this world. The entire family tree is great, and they did something that they didn't actually do in the graphic novel I had, they did it at the beginning, so I couldn't fully appreciate it. But this helps because it's a big family, and understanding the relations between everyone is informative. And it's also just this really interesting setting and stuff. It takes place in Harlem and like like the South, basically, different locations in the South. I was gonna say Mississippi, but that's where it starts, but they kind of move into other places too, and it's kind of just about like the family going up against these demons and learning, like, obviously things kind of unfold from there. There's this bigger threat going on in the form of a super powerful demon implied to be Satan in certain cultures and goes by other names in other cultures, that kind of thing. Everything I'm describing, though, feels like I'm describing like almost a typical comic book series, but it executes everything in so many creative ways. In part, it does that through really creative and cool looking art that really challenges the look and feel of what a story like this might typically be like. That art works really well in conveying excellent action. And there's just lots of great shots and fighting, and it's all well conveyed. I mentioned how in the Anne Nocenti part of the Catwoman story, there was stuff like Catwoman would throw something away and it wasn't conveyed well in the actual story. That's all executed really well in Bitterroot. So I would definitely recommend y'all check out this series for yourself. It came up recently in the wake of the Black Lives Matter movement and protest. People were writing a lot of articles and sharing stuff about comics you can support with creative teams featuring people of color and owned by people of color. And Bitterroot, in my opinion, out of those lists, was the best example of like a solid series anyone can enjoy. It's really well done. I like everything about it. Every single character's got their own little interesting thing. We got like there's one member of the family, he's this big burly guy, but he always talks with this insane vocabulary. Look, like we did like these grad school exams, and I know my vocabulary. I scored really high in verbal aspects of it. It's not really a brag because I didn't score as high everywhere else. I'm telling you, vocabulary is like one of my things. And this guy uses words that I have to look up all the time, and he's just an interesting character. He's been infected with the demons, so he's struggling with that, and that kind of comes up in this particular issue, like book number 6, in an interesting way. But then there's like this guy on the cover here. He has a really interesting journey to get to this point. I don't want to get into him too much because it's an interesting spoiler, and even if I say exactly who that is, we'll spoil the first book a little bit. This woman here is introduced from the beginning, and this story is a bit of a period piece. By my best estimate, it takes place in 1924. I don't actually know that for sure, and it's hard to read sometimes, like what exact date it is. I sort of put that together based on how they refer to this horrible event that happened to them in 1919, and also they talk about the Tulsa Massacre, a real-world event in 1921, I believe. At least that's where it's dated in this book. I don't know if it's changing that or something. So that also makes it interesting because that sort of sets it in a key time period where it's like right in between World War I's and II's, where like that's a cool place to put your fictional story, and it pushes it away a little bit from like I feel like we get a glut of stuff like from World War II, the Old West, certain time periods are really popular choices with just the media at large. I'm not against stories like that. I love me a good Western, but that's just another notch in Bitterroot's cover, or in Bitterroot's belt, I should say. It really understands how to kind of push past that horizon a little bit and tell a bit of a different story. So that's enough on Bitterroot. Highly recommended. Next up, oh boy, I still aren't ready for number 5, and I know I'm just going by order. I'm not making you guys wait for it too much, but it is last up. So until then, we got to talk about Undiscovered Country, Book 1. And let me tell you, friends, so I picked up the first trade. I believe that came out this week. Certainly when my order arrived. This is a new series that people have talked about a lot, but I haven't had a chance to read up until now, by Scott Snyder and Charles Soule. It's another Image book. I had to double check. Giuseppe Camuncoli did the layouts. Finishes were by Danielle Orlandi from issues 1 to 4, and then Leonardo Marcello Grassi did issues 4 to 6. Matt Wilson did the coloring. Matt Wilson's a great colorist, and that shows in this. And Crank, with an exclamation mark, lettered it. Well, Dennis added it because that's the only other name on that page. Okay, so, yeah, I'll just read it. Oh, that's not the blurb I read that sold me on this book. Okay. Basically, here's the story. Undiscovered Country kind of takes place in an alternate timeline that branches off, based on what I read, a little bit before our current present day, and then by like 2024 really veers in another direction. Basically, the U.S. goes through this horrible... Here, they have an awesome timeline at the end that I'll just walk you guys through. Basically, over the course of 10 years, the U.S. faces... Where'd it go? I just read it. Origins. Here we go. So, in retaliation for an endless series of escalating tariffs and trade wars, you know, what's happening right now, that crossed multiple administrations, China called in its outstanding U.S. currency debt, causing an immediate devaluation of the dollar, inflation, and a brutal global recession whose effects were disproportionately felt inside the United States. 2 months later, the first test of the airwell force shield technology developed by the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, DARPA, in conjunction with Bell Labs, are conducted in Arlington, Virginia. Within that year, the U.S. national power grid experiences a colossal failure where a huge swath of the country is out of power for 3 weeks. Something called Project Aurora begins in the valley just outside of Leadville, Colorado, basically in the center of the country at its highest elevation in any city of the United States. Congress approves $20 billion for construction of seawalls around much of the nation's coasts to mitigate the rising effects. More like civil unrest happens. The U.S. takes over all oil and mining and gas reserves. U.S. military begins pulling back from all over the world. Then members of Project Aurora offer a closed Senate Armed Services Committee. And then all of a sudden the U.S. is like, okay, all territory beyond 100 miles of our coastline, or what is it? From 12, they're basically increasing their maritime borders from 12 nautical miles to 100 and claim those areas as sovereign territory for America. Then they close off all immigration except for like extraordinary situations and people of amazing ability. Meanwhile, Project Aurora starts testing like these weird borders that basically start to time dilate. So a patch of farmland can age in an apparent century. So they can like all of a sudden they're starting to be able to grow crops overnight. The final section of the wall along their northern border is completed, and then the President of the United States then announces that all U.S. borders will be closed and ports of entry will be permanently shut down. All communication, trade, treaty, observance, diplomacy, and further interaction with the outer world will cease until further notice. Everyone inside the borders at that point will be allowed to stay, no matter their country of origin. Anyone outside will not be allowed back in. And that's the last anyone heard of America for 30 years. So America then erects this crazy bubble around them, and no one can look in or communicate outside. Like, it just goes dark. So that's where this cover is just a brilliant explanation of it. Just for the next 30 years, the rest of the world has to live without America or even knowing what's happening in there. And that's where this story begins. They get this interest. So the rest of the world goes through a lot, and they kind of get into the history of all that here. 2 empires form out of the rest of the world, one built out of Europe, one built out of Asia. There's implied to be war between them, and then within all these other smaller countries, like on their borders, and also within the European and Asian alliances. And so there's a lot of devastation and bad stuff that's implied to have happened since this 30-year gap. And there's this plague spreading around called Sky that twists up people's spines, and they start bleeding blue fluid from their eyes and mouth, and it's devastating the world. America, after 30 years of silence, sends out this authenticated message basically saying, well, we've been quiet, we haven't been interacting with you, but we have been watching you, and you are on the verge of doom. That Sky plague will wipe out all of the rest of the world in 6 months. But we here in America have a cure. And all you have to do is come on over. And like you have to follow the exact rules to get through the like weird electric barrier thing that they've erected, otherwise their ship will just explode. And like you have to come to these exact coordinates. You can only bring a certain amount of people, but if you do it, we'll share the cure with both empires and save humanity. So both empires are like, all right, like they don't get along at all, but they agree to do this together. They form this thing together, and they send a little expedition, and that's how we pretty much open up with. Now I'm ready to show the art. So we have this copter of people, and if you look closely on this side of the page, that's the wall that borders all of the U.S. And it might be hard for you guys to see, but it's heavily armed. There's these giant sentry guns, and we do eventually get to see one in action. And a crew of like 7 people or so are headed in to get the cure, knowing full well, like if they don't get it, Earth is doomed. And some might argue like the U.S. is going to go with it because they can't necessarily survive a biome without the rest of the world's going on. I don't know. It's unclear what's going on in the U.S. and there's no mystery going on. Tevye says this sounds freaking nuts, and that he's guessing that the U.S. is lying. It hasn't been explained, or like, I'm not going by on spoilers here, but it's very heavily implied that Sky Plague is connected to whatever's going on in the U.S., and I feel like it has to be, and it's so obvious that I think there's more to that. Like, Charles Soule in particular is very clever, and so is Scott Snyder at subverting something that obvious, and I'd be surprised not to. As for the gorgeous art you described, oh yes, that's like one of the best pages, but all of the art's really good. It's kind of got that indie comic look, which I don't even know how to, like, I guess just like very realistic heavy is what I'm getting at. But okay, the next page I want to share is too much because I don't know if I want to give it away. I've shared everything that's like the backstory and prelude to this, but I knew this was going to be a hard book to review because what I'm describing so far is pretty interesting, right? And it's a cool build-up. But once you go past that wall into the US, I feel like literally anything could happen, and it's so well set up that it's like, oh, well, this is really cool. What kind of geopolitics going on in the US? What kind of story is this? This could be a Western, this could be sci-fi, this could be fantasy, this could be horror. We don't know the rules of this world. We don't know what's been going on in here. And as I said at the beginning with the timeline, there's weird time dilation stuff going on in here. And I will give that away. It's a bit of a twist, but I'll just say that what necessarily was 30 years for the rest of the world might not be 30 years for America. So this story could have anything. Tevye says it reminds him of the Enclave from the Fallout series. Yes, that's a good comparison, except if the Enclave did what it did to that little oil rig thing in the first Fallout game, or maybe the second Fallout game, to the entire country. And I can't give away the rest. I'm sorry. You guys should check it out for yourself. Maybe one day we'll talk about it a little more, but I'm looking at the page that changes everything. So I'll do the page before. And I'll get into some other stuff in a minute, but they do a lot of stuff like over here where they flash back a lot, and that provides a lot of context and backstory to the world and these characters. There's like 7 or so characters that get sent to the US, and we learn a lot about each of them, why they were chosen, what's unique about them that makes them a valid candidate for this, although there's a little bit to that. And like, it even impresses how important this mission is, but like just little things like that. So then they go to the US and like the plane crashes. I won't really give away how. Well, they get shot down. That's not a huge spoiler. And they don't really know why. It's like, was that some rogue element of America? Because they were following the rules. That they also debate like, oh, maybe there's something we did wrong without really knowing, or maybe like not everyone in America wants us to be here. Then they see this little light in the distance, and it turns out to be like an old television. In fact, one of the last televisions made in America. There's a lot of little things like that, which get into like little hints of what the culture's like in the U.S. in this new crazy world. So they go up and see, oh, it's a TV, and they turn it off. And then the next page is where we start to get a sense of what the U.S. is like. And I don't want to give it away because it's wild. I turned to this page and I was like, oh, oh, this is a different story than what I thought it was gonna be. And everything after that is just this wild ride. We get a map of what the U.S. looks like. It's interesting. I hope they kind of get into what some of that stuff means a little more because it's ambiguous. There's no, like you gotta kind of see it for yourself because the second I show some of these things, it gives away the game. And for now, if you're listening to this review and you haven't read Undiscovered Country yet, you can get into it and be totally surprised by the US. I would recommend this book. Hopefully we'll follow up on this enough that like I can kind of get into, okay, here's what happens. Like this is where the story is kind of interesting. Totally recommended. It's a little, it kind of rose to the top of what I had read and pulled this week with only one other book beating it, and I'm surprised that book managed to do it. But as promised, and I'm sorry it ended up being last up, I know we kind of dropped off some viewers because I've been talking for 50 minutes straight about other comics, and I do apologize. Maybe if I have enough wherewithal when we republish this video post-stream, I'll try and put chapters in so that you guys can kind of see the reviews you want to see. That might be a good compromise. But of course, my favorite book out of what I pulled this week, including out of the Marvel stuff, I'd say, if you're wondering how these things compare, like Marvel probably is before Bitterroot, but after Justice League. So right in between those, if you want to know where most of those books would rank, or if not all three. But of course, DCeased, Dead Planet, #1. We have yet another DCeased spin-off going on, and honestly, this one feels like the most of a direct follow-up to the events of the original DCeased. I've been enjoying At Hope's End, and I enjoyed Unkillables, although as I was saying earlier, I still haven't managed to get the 3rd issue of that book. I might just have to give up and get it from Digital World's Comixology, because I don't know. I'll send an email and ask. Oh no, it's still listed as TVA for the print edition, because I was looking into that and I didn't miss it. Tevye is saying technically thinks this is a sequel. It reads like a sequel. Because we're Unkillables is kind of like a side thing dealing with like villains that can't easily be killed surviving on the world of DCs, and At Hope's End is kind of, so far at least, the series of sort of short little stories dealing with characters and what happened to them during the fall of Earth. This is about the survivors of Earth, well, the messed up world of DCeased, who made that exodus and set up on a new planet, basically getting a signal from Cyborg on messed up Earth and wanting to go back and try and rescue their friend in spite of everything that happened. Oh, right. I just put something together. Because at the end of DCeased, we learn something about the virus. And I guess it's far enough out I can give it away. But basically, they find out there's a cure. Cyborg does at the tail end of this story. And then, like, no one else knows that. But when these guys return to Earth, well, they end up going up against Zombie Wonder Woman. And yes, someone earlier was saying Zombie Wonder Woman is awesome. I think Davian, you were saying that. I agree. I love how we got to see more of Black Canary Green Lantern in action. She's so cool. That is such a cool idea. She is an awesome Green Lantern. And she gets to use her full powers. Crypto comes back. I don't know if we saw Crypto in the world of DCeased yet, but it's funny because it's also just implied like, yeah, he survived all of this because of course he did. He's a super powered Kryptonian dog. Like, he probably just avoided all the evil people and managed to stay clear of the infected superheroes up until now. Good for Puppy. We got a little moment with John Constantine. This book really has everything. I was trying to look up. I gotta have the artists listed somewhere here under the full who did what thing. There we are. So yeah, Tom Taylor wrote this book, obviously. Trevor Hairsine did penciling. Inks by Gigi Baldacini and Stefano Guadiano. Why has everyone got like a crazy... Never mind. Colors by Rain Barreto. I'm sorry, I cannot pronounce these names for the life of me. Anyways, and everyone did a great job. I like the new Justice League composed of John Kent, Damian Wayne. I don't know if I saw Swamp Thing, but what's her face? There's Wonder Woman, Cassandra Sandsmark, I believe, and Constantine obviously is going to be a thing. It's implied a lot of time has passed between the original DCeased and this story, and it's interesting because it uses things effectively. So the kids have grown up quite a bit, but then all the zombies are just zombies, so they're still alive on Earth, and it's just like this undead planet. And Cyborg's just been sitting right where we left him from the first series. It's cool, guys. I really like it. There's this kind of story just is gonna hammer out those deaths, and we get one, but we get a couple, I guess. I don't know how many people are gonna live through all of this stuff. Someone was asking if Black Canary killed Wonder Woman. I don't think so. I don't think she's dead. She might have killed Superman, not on purpose, but Damian basically tries to stop her from killing Wonder Woman because he's like, there's a cure. They learn Wonder Woman's secret that there's a way to cure them through, cure the people infected by this crazy anti-life equation through Cyborg, and there's a way to stop this. That is fascinating. And I don't know where this series is going to go. I don't know what Tom Taylor's plans are for this all. Dead Planet's going to run for 7 issues, and I'm pretty firmly sold on it. That's awesome. It was a lot of fun, and I'd highly recommend it, and just stood out to me. Like all these DC spin-off books, they're real easy reads for me that I polish off very quickly, in a sense of like I consume them in a short period of time because it's a real page turner is what I'm getting at. Like they're easy to get through, and I'm always curious what happens next because Tom Taylor has a good sense of like bringing in scales. He's a great what if writer, and I'm sure he gets away with this to a degree because he's telling these alternate universes. He can have these big deaths, and he has these moments that stand out a little bit because of that. Because you can have these characters killing each other or dying in these tragic and shocking ways without worrying about the continuity going forward. I'm sure there are people who don't like that because it is a bit of a cheat, and I fully acknowledge that. But I don't know. He has these moments outside of just killing off characters, though. Like I still think all the time about Alfred, Kryptonian powered pills and Injustice just wailing on Superman, being, "You will not harm this family anymore." That's so good. Alfred has a little bit of an appearance in Dead Planet #1, and that was great. ISTKOP. I don't know how to say your name. Those letters are like sync K-pop. What's that? That's not it, but I like my interpretation of it. You kind of missed our reviews, but they'll be reposted in short. So, let's gather everything and give a final report card for this week. I think I have a case over here. Hang on a sec, guys. Yeah. Need this. Need that. And this. So, it was a pretty hefty pull this week. Someone was saying how light my past weeks have been, but that's because it's been a while since we can open things up, and this is the first time I could really walk into the store and shop again, which helped matters. So, it was a pretty solid week, though. We had Black Widow, X-Force, Fantastic Four Empire #0, DCeased Dead Planet #1, Undiscovered Country Volume 1, and Bitterroot #6, Justice League #48, and then Catwoman 80th, which was a bit of a back issue, we'll say. Overall, I think I recommended all of them, some more than others. I think reviewing them all together, lower on that list is certainly Black Widow and Empire. You could probably, or at least this particular Empire book. I liked this Empire book, but you could easily skip it if you're just trying to follow the continuity of Empire itself. X-Force I really liked, and we spent a lot of time talking about yesterday, about how much I am appreciating the X-Men series. I'll catch up and chat in a second. I just want to do a little review of this 2-stream poll week that we did, but this won't be the norm. I just had to do it this way because of the way that my comic book store was hit this week. They just had a bit of a delay, which is fine. You know, these things happen. They do their best and they do a good job. Everything else was solid. Would totally recommend you pick them out for yourself. Justice League, again, pretty weak, so if there's something to take away, I would recommend DCeased for sure. Bitter Root was frigging awesome. Undiscovered Country was not like just this surprise from start to finish, and the good kind of surprise. It's not just doing twist for twist's sake. They got a world built there, and they have the coolest way of revealing it. It's a cool way of doing a mystery, and they clearly have thought through the mystery. Like, they're talking a lot about this Project Aurora. I have no idea what Project Aurora is. It's set up nicely, and there's little hints here and there, but I don't know what's going on with all that. And then Catwoman I enjoyed. In spite of everything, I would still recommend it because, like, it's got one weak story and everything else is pretty strong, and it's worth it for the art. Like, everyone could pick out their own cover because there's so many different covers of these 80s floating around, which is kind of cool, and people can reflect on ones they like. Like, I picked one for the 66, someone else mentioned a different era. Like, whatever you like, guys. And the art within is great. Like, those, like, my favorite part might be like Catwoman during the 80s. That page doesn't have no story to it, but I just like looking at it. It's so cool. Okay, so yeah, that's just my little summary of everything. Tevye was saying, DCeased, in my personal opinion, is my all-time favorite book in DC Comics, and I'm happy to see my boy John Kent's Superboy and Damian Wayne Robin as Batman and Superman. Way better than Bendis' terrible Superman. Yeah, well, I don't know about all-time favorite book, but I talked a bit about it yesterday, but like, I read the first DC series. I was like, okay, that's fine. I've read Marvel Zombies before. And it just had a few different highlights beyond that and a few cool Tom Taylor moments, like Black Canary becoming the Green Lantern. But outside of that, it hadn't really won me over. But like I've said before, those spin-offs are what sold me. Because it's like, okay, Marvel Zombies never followed up on stuff the way Tom Taylor is. And that follow-up is so interesting because we don't get that out of a lot of zombie fiction, and that has sold me on the whole enterprise. I am officially a DCeased fan, and that happened long before even like this Dead Planet book came out. It was good stuff, for sure. So, I think that's about it. If you guys got comments or questions, especially if I missed one along the way, you know, it's like chat was a little busy today. Now's the time to do it while I kind of close things out. I gotta figure out what I'm doing next because I didn't really intend on doing 2 streams like this, and I kind of had to almost rush a little bit even to get all that done just because of the way I got these comics late. So it was a bit of a rush reading them in time just to get you guys a stream like these, but I really like doing these streams. So yeah, like we're doing next week. I did mention what they're gonna be, but I'll repeat it if you don't want to sift through yesterday's stream until the very end when I talk about this. So next week, Death Metal number 2, Strange Adventures number 3, Empire Core Series number 1, Giant Sized Magneto number 1, Amazing Spider-Man number 44, Venom number 26, and Joker 80th Anniversary Edition. Which will be, I wrote that down for sure. Like, after reading the Catwoman one, I was like, these are interesting enough. I'm going to try and get a hold of as many as I can. And on that note, I'm going to write down 2, because someone else mentioned it in chat yesterday. Robin 80th is apparently really good, and I missed it. So I'm going to see if I can get a hold of that too. Maybe they got one lying around somewhere. I don't know. I'll ask the comic book store, see what I got. So, thank you all for joining me for this stream. I'm sorry that things are all a bit of order because I put DCeased first on the title and ended up talking about it last, so I think I will sit down and put in those chapters. That sounds like a good idea, and we haven't tried that before, so it might be an interesting experiment. Until next time, I'll see you guys later. I promised to start in Characters Return in a different video, and I'm still standing by that. That should be coming up soon. And after that, alright. Well, I'm not sure what will come out next because I got a bunch of balls in the air, but I am lobbing some bombs pretty soon, and you guys are gonna see that too. And no, like, I don't know how else to describe that. We are gonna go after somebody. Not somebody. A pretty big organization in the comic book world. But there's some stuff that we need to talk about for that. So that was really ambiguous. It's the We're gonna talk about the CBLDF. Let's put it that way. I got some thoughts on that particular organization and what we should do with it. So stay tuned for that at some point over the next week or so. And yeah, there'll be more streams and stuff coming up. Thanks, guys. See you next time.